Yes, customizing indexing in Commerce Engine. I'm not sure how many people here have used SItecore Commerce. I know a few people that work with SItecore Commerce. Few scary faces. Yes. So I'll go through a little bit of introduction about what SItecore Commerce is, how it is, like an overview, just so that people can actually relate to this presentation. Just an overview of what Commerce Engine is. It's a microservice. So if you're familiar with XConnect, which is a microservice now, which handles all the XDB stuff for SItecore, similar to that, Commerce Engine is a microservice that actually handles all the commerce-related functionality. And if you look at this diagram, the way commerce works is you have controllers, MVC controllers, and then you have commands, and then a controller can call more than one command, and then you have one command can be calling more than one pipeline, and pipeline can be calling more than one block. If you've actually worked with SItecore, you're probably familiar with pipelines and processes. It's something similar. So a pipeline is similar to a SItecore pipeline, and a block is similar to pipeline processor. The only difference is these pipelines and the blocks in SItecore Commerce, they have very strict contracts. So a pipeline has an input contract and an output contract. So object A, output is object B. You can actually have as many blocks as you want on that pipeline, as long as the first block starts with object A, and the last block on the pipeline outputs object B. So there's an input and output, and there's a bunch of logic in the blocks that actually translate or change the object in a way that that achieves that business logic, basically. And then you have minions. Minions are the background jobs, how you have scheduled tasks in SItecore. Similar to those, minions actually take on that role, but in SItecore Commerce. And minions also execute the pipelines and the blocks, the same fashion as a controller and command. Commerce actually works on OData. So all the endpoints that you create, they're all OData endpoints, Microsoft OData. So that's a high-level overview of how commerce actually is structured, because we'll be going through some of this stuff in understanding how to customize this indexing. So I thought it would be easier. So just a bit of overview of how the data is stored in commerce. So all the data is actually stored in a POCO form. So it's actually a JSON blob, serialized and stored in a SQL table. So it's really hard, it's not a relational data where you can actually run some queries easily to fetch the data, because all the data is actually stored as a JSON blob, which is the commerce entity. And then every entity is actually assigned to a list. So if you think about a NoSQL database, where you have objects and then collections, it's something same, but in SQL, NoSQL in a SQL database. And if you look at this commerce entity, so that's the main object that actually stores a entity. It could be a catalog, it could be a sellable item, or it could be a promotion or promotion book, price card. It could be any of those entities. And then you have policies. Policies are mainly used for configuration. So if you think about configuration files in SItecore, in Commerce World, they're policies. And then you have components. So components is a way of extending an existing entity. So you have a sellable item, which is a product. You extend a product by adding new custom components or existing components. So that's how you extend an object in SItecore Commerce. And policies are mainly used for configuration, but they're also used in certain places to actually store information. For example, like list price is actually stored in a policy on a sellable item. How does commerce index? Right. So we talked about minions, like they're background jobs that actually sort of take care of things. Like when someone places an order, the minions are responsible for progressing that order through different states, or we take a payment but we don't settle it. The minions are actually responsible for settling those payments as well, and also indexing. So there's out of the box, you have 3 different indexes. You have customers, you have catalogs, and orders. So all these 3 different types are indexed in commerce. So if you look at this diagram, you have full or incremental index minions and delete documents minion, which is responsible for if you delete an entity, that minion is responsible for removing it from your search service, whether it's Azure or whether it is Solar. Yeah, so it gets the entities in a particular list from the database. Then if you're using Azure Search, it can actually create the index, so it ensures that index exists. So if it doesn't exist, it'll actually create it for you. We'll go through that in a bit more detail in the next slide. If it is a full index rebuild that you're triggering, then it actually deletes all the documents. Then it converts these entities into entity views. So if you, when I go through the sample, I'll actually show you what an entity view means. It's basically just converting an entity into a JSON format with a bunch of properties. And that's how BizFX, the business tools in commerce, is completely built upon entity views. So it converts it into entity view, and then entity view gets converted into documents, like the actual search documents that need to be stored, and then it performs a write or update documents. So if a document already exists, it doesn't update. If it doesn't, it adds it. For incremental index only, once an update is done, because it shouldn't be indexing the same thing all over again, it actually deletes that list membership for that particular entity. So it's like an event. So when someone publishes in SItecore, it raises an event, and then the background jobs go and the index, and then mark that event as processed, right? So it's something similar here. So the list membership is key. For delete documents, so to achieve this, what it does is when an entity gets deleted in commerce, so it gets replaced with an entity called tombstone. It's funny. So you lay a tombstone for an entity with the same ID, and then that minion actually picks up all these tombstones and then goes through and then deletes those documents from your search service. All right. So we talked about how SItecore actually performs the indexing, but what's required? If you wanted to create your own custom index with custom entities that you want to sort of use, or you want to extend any of those existing indexes, you need to understand which policies to touch, right? So you have indexable policy. That policy is required. That actually configures what properties or what fields go into your index. What is the key? What is the unique field? What type of data? Whether it's actually searchable, filterable. We'll go through that in the next slide, where we actually prepare that for Azure Search. But indexable policy is where you actually configure all your fields. The next one is search scope policy. So that's the starting point for any search index. So you have to create a name for your index. So that's your scope. It's really important that if you're using Solar, the name that you configure here and the index name has to match. If you're using Azure, because it actually automatically creates it for you, it does it for you. So, but for Solar, unless you're actually running Solar in a cloud mode, you don't have any of those APIs to automate or create those indexes, right? So if you're doing local dev, usually you just run like a normal instance of Solar. You don't run them in a cloud mode, so you don't have access to all those APIs to sort of automate and populate and create those schemas. Full list name. So that's the name of the list that you actually subscribe an entity to when you create, or when you create a new entity, you need to subscribe to a list. So when you do a full rebuild, it actually takes all the entities that are in that list and then it indexes, but it doesn't delete that list membership. It only does it for incremental. So we need a list name for incremental, and then we need a delete list name. So a list name where when you delete an entity, you assign it to. The next policy, search view policy, is only required if you have to add this functionality to the business tools. So you have a dashboard. So if you go into merchandising dashboard, there's a search. So that search is configured through this policy, search view policy. And then you have minion policy. So you configure minions in commerce using this policy. So like which command to run, how frequently it needs to run, how many documents that it should process in each run, and all of that sort of stuff is configured in the minion policy. Right, next thing. So what do we need to do in Solar? Yep. So if you're using Solar, you need to make sure that the schema is populated for your index. So if you look at here, it's important that the unique key is actually the entity ID. So entity ID is like a primary key in commerce. So similar to like item ID in SItecore, that's unique key. So entity ID is unique in commerce. So it's important that you use entity ID as a unique key, because that's how, like, if you don't use this, you'll have to customize the way the documents are deleted. If you use entity ID, then like it actually works out of the box. Like you don't need to touch the delete documents at all. And the other important thing is the text, like the copy fields. So SItecore Commerce actually creates all these copy fields to the this text field. And when I'll show you in the demo, like when you actually search for something, you don't specify which field to search, it actually searches that text field. So it's important if you're using Solar. Again, for Azure, it works differently. So the next slide, yeah. So how do you prepare for your Azure? Like if you're using Azure as your search, so when you configure that indexable policy with all these fields, so each field has all these properties, whether it's searchable, filterable, sortable, facetable, retrievable. It actually relies on those properties to actually perform the search and also retrieve those fields when you're performing the search with Azure Search. So it's really important that you actually do this. Search scope name, again, that will be your index. So when you first configure a commerce engine on startup, like you run an index job, it goes, oh, do I have this index in this Azure Search? No, I'm going to create it. And the name of that index is going to be the name that you define here, which is in the search scope. Yeah. So the next step is we've got all these indexes. We've configured all the policies. What do we do next? Basically, you need to prepare the data so these minions can actually pick it up and then put them in Solar or Azure, right? So for full index rebuild, we would need a list name, which is like a full list of those entities. If you don't want that certain entities to be indexed, you don't add it to the list. But if you add it to the list, any of those entities that are in that list would actually be picked up when you run this minion, and then they would be indexed. The next one is incremental. So incremental is basically when you're updating you're changing something, not deletes, but deletes is handled by the delete documents minion, right? So when you're deleting, what you need to do is delete that entity, but create this tombstone entity with the same ID as your previous entity ID that you've deleted. So what that does is basically it makes sure that it uses that entity ID and then it deletes that document from Solar or Azure when the minion actually runs. So what custom blocks we actually need? So the main, apart from like actually preparing the data, so you'd actually have your own pipelines and blocks if you're working with your custom entities for saving an entity. So you need to make sure that you actually subscribe it to that relevant memberships as part of, like, when you're saving that entity. But you need one of these blocks to actually translate that entity into an entity view. From there on, all the foundation logic that Commerce has, it actually picks it up from there on and then it puts it in the index for you. You don't need to do anything at all. Like, you only need one of those blocks, the initialize entity indexing view block. So that block basically converts all the entities in your list into a view with all the properties that you need to be populated in the index. The next one is the process document search result block. You only need that if you want to customize the results in VisFX, like in the business tools. I'll show you in a bit. So what that block does is it basically takes the view. If you you might want to replace one of the properties to be like a link to somewhere. So that's what you do in that block. All these endpoints that we sort of, to trigger a minion, they're all there out of the box when you actually install and download that Postman collection. These endpoints are there. So run minion is an out of the box endpoint, but when you're actually running it, you need to pass in the appropriate values. So with the list to watch is promotions. So this is an example of that I'm going to run through today. So out of the box, it has promotions, but it does most of the stuff, like where it actually creates all these lists. It subscribes them to the list, but there's no index. There's no search. So I've created a sample plugin for Commerce Engine, which can actually add that functionality into your solution where you can actually search for promotions. I might actually just jump into the code. All right. Aren't you changing? All right, so just run through the code quickly. So what I've done here is I created two policy sets. So policy sets is basically a collection of policies. So you can actually configure policies themselves, like in your environments, or you can actually create a policy set and then reference the policy set in an environment. For those who are actually not familiar with Commerce, I'll quickly show you what that means. So this is a Commerce solution. The SDK comes with, like when you install SItecore Commerce, you actually get the SDK with it. So this is a sample SDK that they give you. It's a starting point for you. And all these JSON files in the solution, they actually drive how your environment behaves. Like how many environments do you have? Like by default, you'd need 3 environments, like authoring, minions, and shops. Authoring is like your authoring, like, SItecore master database. Shops is for storefront, like, web database. Minions is like background jobs, right? So if you look at one of these files, So it's got a lot of these policies. So you'll see a whole bunch of policies or policy sets. So policy set is a collection of policies, and then you reference them here in the environment file. So if you go to the end, so you'll see that I've referenced that policy set like for promotions. So promotion search policy set here. So, yep. So that's the promotion search policy set. Zoom in. Yep. Right. So hopefully, is that better? Yeah, so I've referenced in authoring environment, I've referenced a promotion search policy set. And in minions, I actually have another policy set, promotions search policy set as well. All right. And then you have shops. All right. All right, there you go. I put them in the wrong place. Right, so this guy was supposed to go into the minions. And now I have two policy sets. These guys. So the minions policy set is where I've actually configured all the minions. So you'll see that this is minion policy. List to watch is promotions list. So anytime a promotion gets created, it automatically assigns a list membership with this name. So there's two ways you can actually achieve a list membership: a transient list membership component or a list membership component. So transient is basically the moment you save that entity, it removes that component from the entity, but it actually establishes that list. And then you have promotions index. So this is my incremental index. So if you look at the namespace, this is out of the box minion, but I'm making it look at my custom list. Right? So promotions index is my custom list. And what entities does it actually process? It processes the promotions entities. So in your case, like if you have custom entities and custom lists, you replace this guy with your own custom entity, and then the namespace, like the list name. And then you have deleted promotions index as well. So that's where, like, when you delete an entity, you make sure you create a tombstone entity and assign that entity to this list as well. And you'll notice that there's a wake up interval. So that's the interval, like, how frequently it actually runs. And then how much milliseconds does it actually sleep between each batch. So if it runs, it means, you give that break in between and then it starts again. And how many records that it needs to process. So depending on your environment and how frequently you're making changes, you can actually fine tune this. And the next one was the actual policies themselves. So you have this search view policy. This is only required if you wanted to add this search functionality to BizFX dashboard, which I'll show you in a minute. This policy is to actually define the index and what different lists it needs to look at, like the full, incremental, full list, and delete list. And what are the entities that it is actually going to be processing. Then you have indexable policy. This is where all the properties, like, this is where you define all the properties for indexing. Once you do all of this, there's a process called bootstrap. So you bootstrap it, so which means you're telling Commerce to use these configuration files, and then from there on, it starts using this new configuration files. So if you go back to, so for those who haven't used Commerce, so this is like an Angular app, which is completely built using the OData endpoints that Commerce Engine actually provides. And you will see, like, if you open up the network traffic, you will see entity views everywhere. So everything is an entity view. So this whole dashboard is an entity view with each one of these are actually properties. So you go through, like, for example, promotions, that's another view. So you will see, like, there's a sub views in a view. So entity view has sub entity views, and an entity view can have properties. So this is a search that I was talking about. So if you need this functionality, then you configure the search view policy. Otherwise, you don't need to. So for example, so if you working with up until 9.2, promotions doesn't have search at all. So this is actually basically adding that search functionality to promotions, because any business, like you do promotions every month, and it quickly adds up. So after 3 months of going live, you'll have like hundreds of promotions, and if you have to go through pagination, you'll be clicking through forever to get to what you need to. So if I went into promotion book, you will see these are all the promotions. See, like, how this is paginated. So if you had like 100 promotions, you'd be like 10 pages. Right. So you can actually search and go, right, demo, for example. So this now is actually not using a particular field that you're searching for. It actually searches for all the fields. So for example, like, these are all the documents in that index that I just created. So you have all these fields, so you can actually filter on a particular field as well. Or if you don't, then like it actually searches that copy field, which you can't see from here, but you can actually see the schema. So if you go into the schema, so it will tell you these are all the fields that are getting copied into that text field. And then if you wanted to filter, you can actually do that as well. Status is, say, draft. Yeah. So it'll give you, or you can just go star. So it'll just give you all the draft ones. You can improvise this, like, you don't have to have this like ugly, like, key and filters. You can actually add some nice dashboards and drop downs and stuff like that, which actually triggers this and gives you that functionality. So I was talking about 2 blocks. So look at the custom code that is required. So these are the 2 blocks that I added, basically. So one of these blocks is to convert the entities. So it actually is processing promotion entities and then converting them into an entity view. And then it goes through all the properties that it needs, and then so it's basically adding those properties into the entity view. And then this block returns, the output of this block is an entity view. So after this block, it takes this entity view, converts that into a document. Like if you're using Solar, it converts it to a Solar document. If it is Azure document, then it just writes it to your search service. The other block is, this is where if you have to customize the way the front end like needs to look, where like, what I did is like I had converted this first column into a link. So this is a logic for it, like, just replacing that name field with entity link. So you can actually click on it and then it takes you to that entity. And where do you actually configure this? So you go into configure. So I'm basically adding, so before it actually adds those documents to the index, so that's where you'd actually add the view block. So you register your view block on both incremental, full index, and like delete, you don't need to configure. It does it automatically because we're not adding any properties, we're deleting stuff. As long as you have the entity ID as a unique key, you're good. Unless you want to use a different unique key, then you'd have to customize that. In the search pipeline, yep. So this guy goes in there if you want to format it differently to how it looks. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. And all of this is actually available on GitHub. So I'll share the link. Sorry, 1 second, guys. Let me come out of this. Yep. So any questions or?
What does the one in line tree look like?
Huh?
What does the one in line tree look like?
Hasn't changed structurally, but I haven't played around with it yet. But I don't know if promotions has been actually added as a index.
Yeah, promotions is now indexed in line tree.
Yeah, that's cool. So, but if you're working on 9.2 and below, feel free to use this plugin. But it's actually a reference. So if you want to customize anything, this will be a reference point for you guys. Any other questions? Looks like it was straightforward, was it?
Very detailed.
All right. Thanks, guys. We'll probably take a break.